On the topic of the PlayStation 5 Pro, something I hadn't considered was the price of it in every other country. So I believe that in England it's about £700 and £800 if you want it to fully function like every console we've ever had in our entire lives. You know, with a disc drive, the thing that it should come with by default, but for some reason hasn't. Anyway, aside from that, check this out. 1,300 Australian dollary dues to get the Pro. Disc drive and stand all together is insane insane to comprehend for the little upgrade difference the Pro actually makes. People 100% getting scammed with this. You know, whenever I do a video about a modern console and whether or not it's worth whatever the price is, an often brought up topic is the comparison between buying a brand new console or just, you know, going full on gaming PC. And generally, I think that for example, I've got a fairly capable PC. It's got a 3080 Ti and yet for some reason, I still always come back to gaming on a console. I'll be playing really old stuff and I'll still be playing on a console even though my 3080 Ti could run it at like 8K if I'm playing a game from a decade ago. But the point is that there is definitely always something to be said outside of just what the hardware is capable of when it comes to deciding where you're going to play your games. But at the point where the latest console is starting to cost over 1,000 of whatever your currency is, although I'm curious how the British pound stacks up against the Australian dollar. I might need to Google that in a moment because it can't be very good. At that point, maybe then it is really worth just going the gaming PC route, because I remember when I upgraded my PC and put a 3080 Ti in, I paid £1,500. But I do game for a living, and it's a tax write-off and all that sort of things, all the benefits that come with doing this as a job versus a regular person who could just play on a console if they prefer playing on a console. You know, it's easier to justify these things depending on the job that you have. I think it's crazy the price of the stuff over there. For example, when you talk about the fact that the majority of PlayStation users or something along those lines are still on PlayStation 4, never mind the base PlayStation 5, and you ask them why, a lot of the times you get the answer is because the base PlayStation 5 is too expensive. Now, to be real with you, I don't exactly see that as a valid reason 4 years on from the game console coming out, because people will spend more than £400 over 4 years on things they don't actually want. I truly believe that if you want something, you will save £400 in 4 years. You just will. I think that the reality behind the situation is that there's just not enough motivation through any other reasons to have a PS5 for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are pretty happy staying on PlayStation 4 because they do not value the graphical upgrades or whatever the performance upgrades may be between the PS4 and the PS5 versions of games, because at this point, if we're being real, as we said in that last video, the majority of games that come out on PlayStation 5 are still coming out with the PlayStation 4 version as well, which inherently holds back what they are capable of doing in said gameplay, never mind just how well they actually perform. But I think this is crazy. I think one use case for the Pro could be if people are finally looking to make the jump from a PlayStation 4 to a PS5 Pro. Like, if they've yet to make that jump, it could be a huge upgrade. Especially if they're going from, like, somehow a base PlayStation 4 up to a PS5 Pro. That could be a worthy upgrade. And you got to think, back on the whole price problem, I think there's got to be a bucket load of reasons why people are not actually upgrading to the PlayStation 5 that are external to the price, because people will happily go out and buy the latest iPhone every year, every other year, every third year, whatever, when it is inherently very similar. Like, I upgraded my phone last month. I went from a 13 Pro to a 16 Pro Max, so I gave it 3 years because I record like 10 to 20 videos a day on my phone every day for TikTok, and my battery health on my old phone was like 80%, and my storage had been full for the longest time, and I couldn't get it any lower, so I needed the upgrade. But again, I can justify these things because it's my job. But I truly think that if it wasn't for the fact that I do this as a job, I probably wouldn't have the latest phone, because there'd be very little reason to, because the 16 Pro feels about the same. The 16 Pro Max feels about the same as my 13 Pro did, just with more space, and the battery lasts longer. But it was £1,400, so was it worth it? No, probably not. It's why a lot of people have returned their 16s from what I've seen on the internet. Before the 13 Pro, I had an SE. Like, before making videos was my job, because I just didn't need a better phone. I didn't see the purpose. So I completely get behind people that are not upgrading because they don't see the value in the money. I think the reality is, it's not that it's too expensive. It's not that the people do not have the money to upgrade should they wish to. It's that the value for what they're getting for said money isn't there in their eyes. And I think that's more realistic. And I think that's going to be even more so the case when it comes to the price of the Pro, especially for guys like my Australian buddies over here that are looking at $1,300. I mean, granted, I would assume that like if a PS5 Pro is $1,300 in Australia, then I can only assume that the price of like PC components is equally ballooned as well. In fact, let's Google what the ratio is, shall we? All right, so £1 is nearly $2 Australian. That's pretty crazy. Could live like a king. But yeah, I just thought that was an interesting one. I hadn't considered. Like, I'm curious to you guys that are in like Australia. I don't know how many of you there are. I could look at my analytics, perhaps. With the prices being so crazy high, is like wages and things like that. Does that match it? So, for example, if the average UK salary is £30,000, and people will argue whether that's true or not all day, every day, but statistically that's true. Is the average Australian salary like 60,000? Is it 1 to 1, or is it like not? Because if it isn't, good lord, that would be a problem when it comes to buying tech or anything or surviving. All right, so next up, somebody says you should add a 1 out of 10 rating scale review to your game log. And 10 people agreed. I have done this before, but I will explain to you why I don't tend to do it. So this is the version of the game log my followers are familiar with, where I simply just track the name of the game I've beaten and the date that the credits rolled. But I made this prettier version earlier this year, literally at the start of the year, and I did have a rating system. But the problem is, and to be fair, there are different angles that I could come at this from. We'll talk about both of them. So the problem number one is that I replay games often enough that it really would be a little bit redundant. Like if we look at my game log, how many times have I've been through this a few times recently, but like I've played through Borderlands and Dark Souls like 30, 40 times each. So it would be really, really redundant to have a rating scale. And in reality, I don't like rating scales for nearly anything ever because they're so incredibly subjective and meaningless. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I watch a lot of reviewers in terms of films and things like that, and they often make up their own scale that isn't numbers because everything's so arbitrary and doesn't mean anything. Like Jeremy Jahns has his own rating scale where the point isn't to really speak on the movie's quality to any extent as much as it is to just be a little bit funny. Like people to this day, when it comes to like Jeremy Jahns' content, have slated him because he gave Suicide Squad from 2016 or whatever it was awesome-tacular, or buy it on Blu-ray. Meanwhile, he'll give something that comes out now that is objectively a way better film, logically anyway, a worse rating. But it's exactly that like rating systems are just and they don't mean much. Because here's the thing: is when I did this rating system over here, when I rated these games, people were getting so annoyed at the ratings I would give things, because generally I don't think I can ever give anything a 5, even my favourite games, because of the fact that would mean perfect, and nothing is ever perfect. Like, I can always find problems with games that I love. The closest to it, like for example, I gave Borderlands a 5 when I played it, simply because it's probably my favourite game that I ever really play. And they will then take that and be like, okay, so you've given Borderlands a 5, but Elden Ring a 3. Oh my god, that's insane, you can't possibly do that. And then go very hateful in the comments, as they always do. And it's like, yeah, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. Like, it's so subjective. It's so, like, I can't really make comparisons between the two. It's always just off the top of my head at the end of the playthrough. And I play through games so frequently in repetition that it would almost defeat the point of doing it entirely. So, yeah, as much as I did used to track, or did have this where I tracked the system that the games were beaten on, the start date, the end date, the rating system, I stopped using this in June. Yeah, in June. And I always use my own one, because my own one is the one I've loved for the last 6 years or so. Rating systems I feel like would work more logically if you were only ever going to do a thing once. Like when you watch like a YouTube reviewer and they're reviewing something, they're generally only going to review it once. Whereas I play games and repeat playthroughs of games all the time. So it'd be a little bit redundant. And whenever I make a video about the games that I've beaten, if somebody was to see a rating they didn't agree with, it would piss them off. And then now we've got arguments in the comments, which in reality wouldn't be the worst thing in the world when it comes to engagement and therefore the video performing better. So maybe I should do it based on that logic alone, but I also don't know whether I've got the brain space for that kind of negativity simply because I put a star that somebody didn't agree with, Oh, and finally, before we go, because I had a comment about this, but I can't find the question to show you guys, or the statement. A dude was saying about how he doesn't understand how with consoles people still bother playing them at all because PC is so much better, blah, blah, blah. And I was baffled because it was a really grown man that had this conversation. Like, I remember when I was a kid and people would have these arguments over whether or not you should be playing on console and PC, and it was something that people were bothered about. But I couldn't imagine being an adult and caring about how other people play their games. It's wild to me. There is always, like I said at the start, there is always a justification for a console, regardless of the quality of the performance of the game that you're playing, simply because of the ease of access, simply because of just how simple things are. For example, and people will go, oh, but this, oh, but that. And I can poke holes in every oh, but you could throw at me. I love being able to sit here and just pick up a controller, put a disc in, and it work and play. People are like, oh, but most of the time that's fine on PC. Yeah, most of the time, but not all the time. Oh, you can use a controller on PC. Yes, I can, but sometimes it disconnects for other reasons that are outside of my control. I have a USB Bluetooth dongle so that I can use a 360 or an Xbox One controller because my motherboard doesn't have Bluetooth built in, and sometimes for some reason the signal just dropped, so I had to resort to using a wired 360 controller for way back in the day, which is by default a downgrade than just using a PlayStation 5 controller on a modern PlayStation 5. There's always an if and or a but. I play a lot of old games. If you play a lot of old games, there are a lot of games that simply do not work very well on modern hardware. That is just another thing. I can't be bothered with having to do widescreen patches or mess with INI files or anything like that when I just want to put a game in and play said game. And there is something to be said about that versus PC gaming. Everything has its pros or its cons. The pros of the consoles is the things that I just said. The cons are the PC version is going to be a better experience once you are actually playing because it's going to be moddable, it's going to be prettier, it's going to perform better generally, depending on hardware. But I think that a lot of people, when it came to the console wars versus PC master race stuff when we were younger, they'd argue against whether PC was better. But the point is that PC, assuming better components, is objectively better for actually gaming. But it's the whole experience and the situation behind the scenes. So, for example, I often like having gaming retrospectives on my off monitor while I'm playing on my TV. And sometimes games won't let me click out properly when I'm full screened in a PC game. Not every game seems to have windowed borderless mode and it just works perfectly the way that I want it to, and stuff like that. So it's all just here, there, and everywhere. It's all just preference at the end of the day. I just thought it was an interesting one because I don't feel like I see console war level comments very often these days. So when I do, I'm like, that was an adult. Weird.